If many of your listeners are teens or in their 20s, I would say this is a huge advantage you have over people who are older and more experienced, because once you get a bit more experience, first of all, you're less likely to take risks. And secondly, you just think things aren't going to work because you've seen so many things that don't work. And what's beautiful about being younger is you just kind of assume things can work. You can make things work. And that's brilliant. That's how things change.
On today's episode of Careers Unwrapped, I'm very excited to have with me today Brett Wigdortz, who's an entrepreneur who's, I think, a bit of a visionary in the field of education. He's best known perhaps for founding Teach First, which is a really transformative initiative that became one of the largest graduate recruiters in the UK, putting well-educated graduates into some of our more challenging schools, and I think really changed education in Britain. And beyond Teach First, Brett has continued to influence the educational landscape as the co-founder of Tiney.co. And they specialize in really revolutionizing early childhood education for the very youngest kids. So his work's not only impacted millions of children and also thousands of educators, but also perhaps a benchmark for how education and professional training can intersect. And today, Brett is hopefully going to share his journey in social enterprises, what he's learned along the way. So Brett, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
I think one of the things, let's just kick this off maybe with a bit of an icebreaker, because teachers can change lives. And has there ever been at any stage a teacher in any part of your education who you remember for still having had an impact on you?
Definitely. When I was at Teach First, we'd often ask like business leaders or these very famous, very important people, and you'd always see a glint in their eye where, they'd remember a teacher. And it's very, very few people who, can't have a teacher come to mind and they think of someone who's influenced them, no matter how old they are or how senior they are. I could think of a lot, from the time I was very little. Two always come to mind. One is Mr. Levsky, who is my economics teacher when I was 16, where he just introduced a subject I had no idea anything about. And he was so exciting and he brought it to life in such an amazing way that he ended up, pushing me to study it at university, which I definitely wouldn't have done if I hadn't had him as a teacher. And I think that probably led to some of my jobs as a career, as a management consultant or other things, which I never would have done if I hadn't studied economics. And, when he retired, actually, a lot of his ex-students all on Facebook organized a whole big book, to send to him. And it's just amazing. He's one of these teachers who just influenced so many lives because he was just such a great, exciting teacher. And he really brought to life. And the other one I was talking about is Mrs. Wolf when I was 12 and 13, who taught this like little enrichment class for people who kind of, I went to a school where it was pretty working class and most people ended up not going to university. And, I think there was a few of us who were really interested in academics, and she created this little enrichment program for about a dozen kind of geeky 12-year-olds and had us do all sorts of really cool things after school and lunchtime and all sorts of stuff. And I just remember her, bringing real excitement to learning and helping me and some of these other kids really realize, there was a place for us who, really, I just remember us talking about really exciting, new things that 12-year-olds normally talking about, really enjoyed. And she treated us like an adult right from the start. Those are too many teachers who have influenced me, and I'm sure you have some and everyone has some.
Yeah, I think particularly for me, there was an English teacher, Mr. Grady, who, when I was a teenage boy, and I didn't, of course, have a particular love, like a lot of teenagers do, for Shakespeare's poetry. And he came along as the new English teacher. And he did something magical, which was sort of lift the lid on the stories that were being told by these writers and just made me and others go, wow, actually, this was really exciting and amazing. And he was definitely part of a real lifelong lifelong love I've had for reading since then, when he just sort of, unlocked the door and showed us the stories inside. Amazing, amazing teacher. And you then, through your work, you've undoubtedly led to many amazing teachers going in short or long periods of time to the education system. But I'm interested to start at the beginning of Teach First. So somebody born in the United States, a journalist, a management consultant background. What led from there to the catalyst that eventually became Teach First?
So I was a management consultant and I had been doing lots of work on the war for talent. So how organizations could attract the best talent. And I come from a family of teachers. So my mom's a teacher, my brother, all my aunts and uncles and cousins are all teachers. And when I was in London, I got on a project looking at how businesses could help education in London, because this was 2001 and schools in London were underperforming. Lots of businesses at that point were really worried they couldn't hire enough staff who met their standards because education wasn't doing well in the capital. And our old friend Tony Blair had been elected a few years earlier with the promise that his priorities would be education, education, education. And he hadn't really done as much in education as he would have liked. So as part of that, me and some of my colleagues, we came up with an idea of a program to attract great talent into education and build a leadership movement around education and around closing the education gap. And the idea would be, how can we ensure children from the lowest income backgrounds get access to the best teachers, or there's a whole leadership movement of individuals who through their careers really care about the education of these kids. And that started to Teach First. That led to Teach First. I took originally a 6-month leave of absence from McKinsey, which was my employer, to try to get it up and running. And then after 6 months, I thought this is a lot more fun than being a management consultant. And I left for good and ran it for 15 years, which wasn't the original plan, but was a great, serendipitous career change.
I'm thinking back to your first 12 months in this. So you moved from management consultancy, where there's both theory and practice, working with a variety of different clients, into being focused on just one thing. What were the biggest challenges in those first 12 months?
Gosh, there were so many challenges. I mean, for so many reasons, people thought Teach First wouldn't work. And, it's one of these great examples where naivety and, not really knowing how difficult something is really pay off. And if many of your listeners are teens or in their 20s, I would say this is a huge advantage you have over people who are older and more experienced, because once you get a bit more experience, first of all, you're less likely to take risks. And secondly, you just think things aren't going to work because you've seen so many things that don't work. And what's beautiful about being younger is you just kind of assume things can work. You can make things work. And that's brilliant. That's how things change, that sort of belief. So, at the time, there was only a handful of graduates from Oxford or Cambridge, is one example, teaching in state schools. I remember meeting the head of careers at Oxford who said they had 5 leavers that year who had gone on to teach in a state school. So the idea that lots and lots, hundreds of top graduates would want to teach in the most disadvantaged schools was seen as very odd. I remember people saying they have many other better options available to them, which I didn't think was true. The idea that schools would necessarily want these graduates was seen as odd because, schools were seen as stuck in an old way of doing things. The idea that you could train these graduates very quickly and in a really great way to make an impact with kids very, very quickly. And we did a different type of teacher training where it was intense summer with lots of then mentoring and support throughout the year. That was a very new way of doing it. And then, for me, the bigger thing was I was, I think, 26, 27 years old at the time. That idea that I could make this work when I'd been in England for a year. I never led anything before. I didn't know what I was doing. These were all like these massive issues that, if you were to give it to like a senior civil servant, they would say this is impossible probably, which many of them did at the time. But somehow, we managed to find ways through some of these issues by just looking at things differently.
And how did the education establishment treat you then? Everything from Department for Education through to actual head teachers unions? So
it was a real mix. So on the one hand, there were some brilliant people in education who were really change makers. One of them passed away a year ago, Sir Tim Brighouse, who's always a hero of mine, who was one of these guys who always thought in a youthful way. You always meet people, I think he was in his 60s or 70s even then. And you could see he was still a youthful way of thinking, and always someone who was looking at changing the system and, a real can-do attitude. And there are many people in education like that. There were also some people in education who just, on the other hand, just thought, well, things are so bad, like they couldn't find teachers. In some ways, if you want to make change happen, it's great to, be part of something where people all realize and agree that things, aren't going well, because they're more up for revolutionary ideas at that moment. And I remember someone saying, if Australia stopped sending us so many teachers, we'd have to shut down schools at that point. So the head teacher unions were very supportive. The teacher unions actually weren't that bad. I think they were, curious, and they maybe were a bit skeptical, but they, were open to it. And I think some of the schools, they were just so much needed, these teachers, that at the time they were just, even if they did have reservations, they still were like, fine, whatever, let's just take it. And then they were pleasantly surprised at the positive impact these teachers had. So, we had a few naysayers, but, for the most part, people were just looking for solutions, I think, at that point. And ultimately, Teach First becomes one of the
biggest graduate employers in the UK. But going back to the beginning, again, this first year, your first 20 or 30 Teach First applicants, the first Oxbridge students perhaps who you place in some pretty challenging schools. What was your sell to them about why to come to Teach First rather than go straight to McKinsey on maybe a much bigger salary?
So our sell, it changed a few years in. So I remember our sell those first few years, we probably wouldn't have used a few years later. And it was a naked appeal to, getting the best of the best, kind of an elitist sort of way of looking at things, saying, if you really want to do the best job, first of all, this is a great leadership role. So I think we were always clear on that teaching in a low-income school is a real leadership role. You're leading lots of young people to a place they wouldn't get to themselves, which is incredible leadership. So we sort of changed their teaching. The early years, we did make a bigger pitch, the idea that even if you did leave after 2 years, because there was a 2-year commitment to the school, there were lots of other options available to you. So you were actually opening options, not closing options. At the time, I remember I used this theory around the war for talent. That was this kind of business theory at the time. And there were like 4 or 5 things that it said the war for talent. And what was interesting is big employers like McKinsey, Goldman Sachs, Deloitte, Civil Service Fast Stream, the SAS in the military, they all use these war for talent ideas. Like, you look at their marketing and they used it, but teaching never used it. So, one of the ideas is about keeping options open. So if you join Deloitte, McKinsey, SAS, Civil Service Fast Stream, you have lots of options in your life. Another is you get really great world-class training that, is fantastic. Another is you'll be working with people you really respect who, you'll learn from and they'll become fantastic colleagues, and they're people you're going to want to become colleagues with. So there's a little bit of elitism in there. Like, you'll be with people who you really want to be with. And then there's something in there about making a difference, about leadership. I always laugh, like the big accounting firms, if you look at their graduate schemes, they always don't say, and you're going to be a wonderful accountant, going over people's books on a spreadsheet. Instead they say, you're going to be a leader, you're going to lead change, because that is the message that graduates want to hear. And that is the war for talent message. And that's what we really majored on with teaching, where you really do lead from day one.
What about the funding? How did you get money to do this?
Yeah, so that was the sort of thing where it was an easier time, I'd say, in 2001 than it is in 2024 to get funding. We needed money. We needed about £1 million to get started, and then we needed to figure out ways to be sustainable. And the way I looked at the £1 million was I said, okay, let's see if we can get half of it from government and half of it from the business world. And I just kind of assumed like this was the sort of thing that was done. Later, people told me, they'd never seen anything done this way. But I said, let's try to find 10 businesses that'll each give us £50,000. Because all these businesses are saying they need to improve education. They're not getting enough graduates. This is a perfect thing for them to invest in. Once we got that, we then went to government and said, look, we got all this business money, but that only will be unlocked if the government also pays some of the startup costs. And we somehow managed to get it through after lots of meetings and going around and a bit of difficulty. For ongoing costs, what I tried from day one is to make as much of a balanced income streams as possible. So my dream in the business plan was that a third of our income would come from fees for services, which I think is really important for a charity or for any organization, obviously, because you then have people paying for your service, so what you're doing is adding value somewhere. A third from philanthropic sources, and a third from central government, which at the time was mostly to pay for the teacher training, because government pays for, at least that point, paid for teacher training for all new teachers. So broadly, when we started, we had a third, and that, felt like really sustainable income streams.
Now, when you look back at that as well, and I think of myself when, I set up my current business, which was about 20 years ago, and the difficulties I went through in some of the early years and almost going bankrupt twice. And you look back on those and it's throwaway lines and rose-tinted spectacles. And I thought it was fine. But at the time, it was really stressful. And so what are the pieces in your early part with Teach First that you recall that, that really did weigh heavily on you? And how did you deal with those as somebody who was still in their 20s?
Yeah, people do amazing things in their 20s, right? So I think often part of society thinks you have to be a lot older to make a real impact. Some of the best entrepreneurs, have done great things in their 20s. Some of the great, Nobel Prize winners came up with great theories in their 20s. So I do think as a society, we sometimes underestimate, first of all, young people. And, it's something I could talk about my time chairing National Citizen Service and some of the other work I've done. you just see, young people are pretty amazing and, are usually able to achieve a lot more than society allows sometimes. And, that is one thing I heard society helps unlock the power of young people even more. There's lots more we can do. But one of the advantages of being young is you have a lot of energy, you have a lot of belief. You're not so worried about risk taking. You're not so worried about failing as you are when you're older. You don't have a mortgage and kids and everything like that sometimes. And these are all massive benefits that you have when you're young that you don't have as much when you're older. So I think, at the time, we had so many failures along the way, and I do think often when you hear from entrepreneurs, it is rose-tinted glasses and, you might hear these stories and you might think, oh gosh, I'll never do something like that because, I've failed twice or I'd be so worried about failing. I mean, we failed in every way imaginable. The first time I met the minister, he said no to me. And then, I realized I did it in a totally wrong way and, made too many enemies where we didn't have to, made some bad hiring decisions, communicated things really badly. The first summer institute somehow, where we were training all of our new teachers, somehow made it through sticky tape. And, I was probably working 100-hour weeks, for 6 weeks during that training institute, just kind of building this bridge as it's going. It very much felt like, building a plane while you're flying it. So, we just wanted to make sure things were working a day or two in advance. And I think just kind of, realizing things don't have to be perfect sometimes. You can kind of push your way through things. And it somehow worked. And then, that managed to build a real base for the future.
And from that early stage then, from the entrepreneurial part, you're in your late 20s, you're getting the first million, you're getting the first teachers through, first financial support to build a platform on. Fast forward that 10 years ahead, what do you think were the differences in your role 10 years in?
So 10 years in, I had learned and had mentors and developed where I think I was a better manager and maybe able to focus a bit more on my leadership skills in ways that were helpful. I think probably in the early days, I was just like this fire hose where, some of what I was doing was helpful, some of it was damaging. And I probably wasn't, trusting staff enough. I wasn't managing well. I wasn't, thinking through like the consequences of some of the things I was saying. I think sometimes at that stage, I would just say things without thinking through how that might have other consequences in the organization or other people's priorities. So, I think I certainly developed a lot during those 10 years. And during that time, the company, Teach First really grew a lot. I mean, we grew from about 180 teachers our first year to over 1,000 a year, 10 years in. And, that was an incredible growth story during that time. So you have to run things differently because you can't do things sticky tape and, you burn people out and also, it just won't work.
And you mentioned leadership there and a couple of times already here. In terms of yourself as a leader, can you reflect upon what you know now or the type of leader you are now compared with the leader who got Teach First off the ground 20 years ago?
I mean, I hope, you hope that you improve over time. I think there are things that were better when I was younger. Like I probably had more energy and worked harder and, had even more belief than I have now because it's really hard to keep that as you get older. I think on the other hand, I'm probably more, you get wiser as you get older and you see how you get pattern recognition and you start seeing, okay, if I communicate something in this way, it'll have that effect. So I need to think different ways to get to where I want to go, as opposed to just steaming straight ahead. So, hopefully I've built some skills over the last 20 years that I didn't have 20 years ago, because otherwise that'd be sad, actually.
I think that it's a constant balance leadership between learning and building confidence, but not thinking you've got there. I've been lucky enough to run 3 very, very different organizations. And before that was an officer in the military, in the army, so you're supposed to be a leader there as well. And so now I get to a stage where I think, hang on, I've been through commercially a couple of recessions, COVID, business startups, growth. So I'm confident and comfortable enough to think, hey, look, if a problem arises, there's probably a solution to it. But equally, trying to be conscious enough to think, therefore I can be complacent and know it all, because the second that happens, it's just going to hit you in the face pretty quickly. So you've moved on, obviously, from Teach First now, and then you were co-founder of Tiny.co. And I'm interested to know about the journey there, but perhaps just give us a quick summary, first of all, of what tiny.co is and the problem it's solving.
Yeah. So, I mean, during my 15 years at Teach First, and I also helped start Teach for All, which is this global part of Teach First, I visited hundreds of schools. And what really struck me, when we started Teach First, we started in secondary schools, only in secondary schools. And people often ask, what's the biggest mistake you made in Teach First? And I would say, one of the biggest mistakes I made was not going to primary schools quicker because, I think primary schools are even more important than secondary schools in ensuring children are ready for adult life and, closing the gaps between wealthier children and less advantaged children. And when you go to primary schools, you do realize there's a whole subset of children who just aren't even school ready at the age of 6, 7, 8, who just start school. And when I say not school ready, it's not like they don't know how to sit down and do their math. They don't know how to play. They don't know how to communicate with other children. They don't know how to, go to the toilets. They don't know how to, just be part of a group that works together in any way. And it really struck me the importance of early years. And I think I've read quite a bit over the last few years that there's been so much scientific work done on brain development, on cognitive development that says the first 3 years to 5 years, most of your cognitive development happens, so much brain development occurs that actually early years teachers and your early years experience is more important to your life chances and how you do educationally and work-wise than what you do in secondary school. And it's very counterintuitive. And I think historically we have this belief that, early years is just kind of let kids on their own and it doesn't really matter. Or there's, I think, a bit of, sexism that, moms just do it on their own and it's not like serious teaching that, people do in secondary school. But that's really not true. Primary schools, early years is incredibly important for the children. And I started thinking, how can we get more children access to outstanding early years education and care? And similarly to Teach First, I think the big constraint there is we need a lot of wonderful, fantastic, well-supported adults working with these children. And we know there's a lot of really wonderful adults out there who love working with small children, but yet there's a massive shortage of talent in the sector. And I think the reason is because a large part is the pay. The pay you earn in early years is a lot less than even a primary school teacher or a secondary school teacher. Often it's not even living wage or anything like that. And so I started thinking, how can we create a process where early years professionals can be better supported, earn more money? And I got very excited about childminding, which is these, highly regulated in England, small nurseries people run in their homes. Many, listeners might have had childminders themselves. But the number of childminders has been dropping in England for the last 20 years. It's dropped in half in the last 10 years. So it's been a real problem. And the reason I felt is there just wasn't great support for people who wanted to become childminders or once they were childminders, to run their business. So I thought, is there a way to use tech to help solve this public problem? So I co-founded Tiny with these two wonderful tech entrepreneurs, Ed Reed and John Newbold, who had both started a bunch of other things in the tech industry before. And the thought was, can we create a whole operating system for childminders? Can we do something where we can support bringing more childminders into the sector? Once they're up and running, help create a whole network of childminders like we did at Teach First, help them run their businesses well, help, them support the children more. That's what we've been doing the last 4 or 5 years.
And so one of the major differences from an outside perspective of starting tiny.co and starting Teach First is that this is much more of a tech startup. And how are you personally, as an entrepreneur, a social entrepreneur, how are you having to adapt and change to something that is much more of a tech business?
Yeah, I mean, during my 15 years at Teach First, we tried to do a number of tech innovations and we failed in almost all of them. Charities, for the most part, don't do tech very well. And what struck me since I started Tiny, it's because it's really hard, first of all. And we just really, and I realized since I've been with Tiny, we really under-resourced it. You need really good project managers. You need really good engineers. You need really good designers. You need really good vision around the tech. And there's a reason most tech projects fail. It's because you need really good talent to do it. So I mean, that's the first difference is just, at Tiny, my co-founders have a really good teams of people who really know how to build these products and how to test them with customers and ensure they're being used well. And, I think these are just really, really hard things to do well, which it's very difficult to do in a charity environment. I think the other thing is, I think there's less of a difference between charities and businesses as people think. Often people have this mindset that they're very different. I've met some very senior business leaders who can be quite arrogant about it and say, businesses do things like that and charities don't and blah, blah, blah. And that's not necessarily true because charities, we need to get funding. Charities need to, fundraise. They need to find people who use their services. While there can be some difference with some businesses, I wouldn't say it's any easier than running a business. So I don't think that's quite as different. I think maybe the difference is being a VC-backed business, your backers want you to grow very fast, while most charity boards don't want their charities to grow very fast, which I think is a bit of a problem with charities because charity boards have a lot of risk if something grows fast and fails, while I think the incentives for the VCs are on the opposite side. If it doesn't grow fast, then that's a big risk for them. While I think charity boards, if it does grow fast, it's a big risk. So I think the risk, element is on a different side.
And can you detect any changes in yourself as a manager, as a leader, as a person, starting Tiny.co as opposed to starting Teach First? What is different about this version of Brett with the experience that years have given you now?
It's a good question. I think, trying to move much faster, and I think being really clear on hiring people who are better than me for all the other roles and listening to them much more than I would have early on in my career, I think. I think really integrating customer feedback a lot better, I'd say, maybe than we would have. I think one difference is charities do talk a lot. And, one of the problems with charities is it's really hard to know when you're successful. So even at Teach First, we would always define what does success look like? Is it recruiting teachers? Is it if they, were great in their 2 years of teaching? Is it if they 5 years down the road were doing something in education? Is it if schools are better? If all that happened but schools didn't change, then, was that a success? And actually you get these navel-gazing conversations in the charity world, which are kind of important because you're like struggling to figure out how do you prioritize one thing over another based on success. With the businesses, even though we're a very mission-focused business, in the end, you're successful if people are paying for your services and you're growing your revenue basically more than you're growing your cost. That makes it a bit easier to know if you're successful.
And you mentioned they're hiring people who are better than you, which I so agree with. The early years of my current business, We Are Futures, I was probably better at most things we had to do than the people who are working with me. And I look around my wider team now and think, I'm not sure there's anything that I haven't got people around me now who are better at it than me. And that confidence to let go, once you first start crossing that threshold and going, no, I've got to trust them, their skills, their experience, they can make the decisions. And you start letting them make decisions and it all succeeds and grows. It's just a wonderful feeling as an entrepreneur, as a business leader as well. And I'd love to sort of reflect a little bit on the whole career path you've had so far and the real learnings from that. And perhaps ask you to use your imagination a bit. If you're going back to speak to younger Brett, yourself when you were perhaps 20 years, 21 years old, what has your career path shown you that you might say to younger Brett, do more of this and do less of that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I had a very serendipitous career path where it wasn't planned in advance. One thing that I think which do more of is take advantage of opportunities along the way. I think, I've had 4 or 5 times in my career where some doors opened and I've taken advantage of it. And I think that's been my big success in my career. I think the advice I'd give is you don't have many of these moments in your career. I think especially when you're young, you think you're going to have hundreds of them. And, if you're lucky, you'll have a handful of opportunities where some great opportunity will pop out. People often, the advice people give is you want to extend your luck area as wide as possible, right? So I think that's something I've always done, which I would always recommend. You go to a lot of things, you go to events, even if you're not really sure why you should be there sometimes. You talk to lots of people, you put yourself out there, you read a lot, you learn a lot, and if you do all that and you increase your luck area, you're going to get a few good opportunities in your career. But I think when you're young, you think you're going to get hundreds of them, like I said. And the truth is you're only going to get a handful. And I think when you get one, think really hard about just jumping in and taking advantage of it because they don't come around a lot, And I think with Teach First, that was a great moment where this opportunity came. It was a bit crazy. I wasn't the right person for the job. I was taking a pay cut, everything. But I thought, okay, I'm not going to get many other opportunities like this. Let me just do it. And I just jumped in and did it. And that was one of the best decisions of my life. I think there was probably a few other times I probably, maybe I stayed at Teach First a bit too long. Like I never really thought, what am I doing after this, or how am I developing after this? And, I maybe missed some other things along the way because of that. I don't know. But that would definitely be my advice. Look for those couple in a lifetime opportunities and just realize how special they are.
Yeah, I'm struck with all of the interviews I've been lucky enough to do through Careers Unwrapped. Amazing people with so many different careers and pathways in that. How very, very few of them who, let's say, have got at least 10 or 15 years into their career are doing something that was on their career pathway 15 years beforehand. Because you arrive at decision points you weren't expecting, doors open or close in front of you that you weren't expecting. It's something you have to be ready for, and you've got to be able to embrace. And just looking forward a bit then, Brett, what's success look like for you ahead? Next 5 years, 10 years, or 1 year? What's success feeling like? Where do you want to go?
That's a good question. I mean, and to your other point, I was just talking to my nephew who's at university, and we were talking about AI, and I think it's impossible to plan your career today because literally no one knows what jobs are going to look like in 5 or 10 years, 20 years time. I mean, it's impossible. So, I think you have to be open to opportunities and change. Otherwise, it's going to be a difficult career for most people. I mean, for me, for the next few years, I really would love Tiney to be successful. We currently have 1,200 childminders. We want to get to 20,000. That's our goal, or so. We'd love to start working in a few other countries where, we start talking to people about how we could help support small nurseries in those countries. The goal would be, that early years, there's more children who are accessing really high quality early years education in England and around the world, and more children benefit, more parents benefit, and, more practitioners benefit, that it's a win-win-win. So, I mean, that's what I'd love to build in the next few years.
Brett, thank you so much for joining me today on Careers Unwrapped. I could keep this going for longer and longer here. And there's some really interesting takeouts for me personally from this, from a careers perspective. There's a whole group around the entrepreneurism, the starting out when you're younger, when you're in your 20s, and perhaps what some might call naivety is perhaps just an openness to try, about overcoming obstacles, about leadership development, the lessons learned during that. I completely agree with you about what you said about unlocking the power of young people and leadership in that particular area, and then hiring people who are better than you ultimately. But I'm really struck, if there's one thing I would suggest listeners take away from this short conversation, is the point you made towards the end about extending your luck. I haven't heard it said like that before, but the more luck you can put in by reading, by meeting people, by going to events, the more opportunities that's going to provide for you. So take advantage of those opportunities. A career is not a planned path, and definitely extends your luck. Brett, it's been brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us. Really interesting conversation, and so much to take away for anybody at any point who's just thinking about what they want to do next or starting something of their own. Brett, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This podcast is sponsored by We Are Futures. To find out more about We Are Futures and how we can introduce your brand, business, or organization to the mass markets of tomorrow, visit www.wearefutures.com. Make sure to search for Careers Unwrapped in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Remember to click subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at We Are Futures, thanks for listening.